Klavdia is professor and chair of Slavic literatures at the University of Dresden in Germany. And she's spending this semester, her sabbatical, here as the visiting scholar at the Harriman Institute. Klavdia is the author of many books, and I have in front of me her latest book, Reinventing Tradition, Russian Jewish Literature Between Soviet Underground and Past Soviet Deconstruction. And she also wrote on Chekhov and currently is writing a book on Soviet Underground. Together with Klavdia, we co-edited and continue co-editing volumes on Soviet non-conformist, Soviet post-Soviet non-conformist literature and culture. We co-edited a special issue of the journal Russian Literature, and now we are proofreading a volume that will be 1,054 pages long, believe it or not, a large format, on the Soviet underground culture. In addition to this, Klavdia also edited such volumes as Counter-Archive Memorial Practices of the Soviet Underground, forthcoming Multinational Faces of Socialist Realism, Beyond the Russian Literary Canon, together with Evgeny Dobrenko, cluster of articles that was recently published in Slavic Review. Jewish underground culture in the late Soviet Union, post-colonial Slavic literatures after communism, Jewish spaces and topographies in East Central Europe, construction of literature and culture, East European Jewish literature of the 20th, 21st centuries, identity and poetics. She received numerous fellowships and 2 prizes for outstanding achievements in humanities, among others from the German Research Foundation, which is a very solid institution to say the least. And she is the editor of, I can pronounce it, Journal of Slavic Studies, published in Germany.
Zeitschrift für Slavistik.
Most Klavdia can pronounce it. As you can guess from this very hasty list of Klavdia's main publications, she has been doing postcolonial studies for a significant period of time, and for her it's not the twist of intellectual fashion. I think we actually met at the conference on postcolonial studies that you organized back in 2012 or 11, so no,
14 or 15.
14 or 15 maybe, but that was long time ago, and since then Klavdia moved quite significantly in that direction. As I said, recently she published her article in Slavic Review on this subject, and that's one of many articles. Another one, also very important, was in Новое литературное обозрение. And what Klavdia is going to present today is a part of this vector of her research, and the title of the presentation is in front of you, but I will read it. Fish, Idols, and Dread Gods, Reinventing the Literary Canon in the Soviet Indigenous North. Klavdia, please.
Thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me to Harriman Institute as a visiting scholar, and for the chance to deliver this guest lecture and to share some ideas and results of my work. I'd like to shortly tell about the emergence of this paper, of this talk. It was conceived, it is based on a paper, on the article that Mark has already mentioned, part of the cluster, which my colleague from Venice University, Evgeny Dobrenko, and I recently published in the winter issue of the journal Slavic Review, as a commemoration of the 100 years of the formation of the Soviet Union, 1922. So the idea came to our mind long before the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And today this theme has become even more timely, I would say, in light of the demands for decolonization of the academic curriculum, and debates around Russian culture and Russian literature and the cultures of the former imperial borderlands. So our idea was to analyze, despite the common idea that in the Soviet era there was almost nothing in non-centers, in non-Russophone literatures, but national oppression and Russification, which is undoubtedly was present. The idea was to analyze how in Soviet times, the national cultures and literature in this case underwent different stages of discovery or rediscovery of their national identity, including cultural emancipation, resistance, but also a newer wave of nationalism. So we know that it was a very contradictory or complex process of desovietization with quite ambivalent facets. So in each national literature, the process proceeded in a different way, of course. And I would like to show the table of contents. But I think this is the button. Or maybe this direction.
Okay. So let me be here to even this way.
Just have time.
You go.
But I need this picture to
Here we go.
exactly wonderful.
You got it.
It's not super. I have to. So that is the table of contents of this issue. So the idea was to analyze how different national literatures, or in each national literature, the process proceeded alongside, of course, different languages, national mythologies and histories. And the own experience, often very tragic in the early Soviet time. So we also assumed that there existed in the Soviet Union, it was very important for us, both not only a variety of manifestation of the canon, this is a famous fact, but also different regimes and practices of referring to it. So including different forms of deviation from it. So the questions were, among other things, what were the translation processes from the center to the periphery and the other way around? How did local tradition influence the aesthetic system of the center and vice versa? The most important question for me was what happened with socialist realism, so socialist literary canon and art canon, when it was adapted by nations and ethnicities that were conspicuously different from Russian, Western and Slavic traditions. So for example, Muslim or polytheistic small peoples and so on. It is still rather under-researched, this topic, because these cultures were discriminated, and of course there are a comprehensive history of these regions, but for example art and literature of these regions is still waiting for research. So my part was about the Soviet literatures of the indigenous northern peoples and their version of socialist realism. I write at the beginning of my article that I was reminded of the frightful fairy tale from Vladimir Sharov's novel "Будьте как дети," Be Like Children, published 2007, when I began to study these literatures. In a satirical version of Russian history, the leader of the revolution, Vladimir Lenin, paralyzed and having lost his coordination and ability to speak, shortly before his death, forges plans at his estate in Gorky for a new salvation of Russia. Seeing that his project doesn't work, or for ultimate victory of the proletariat, has collapsed with adult people, he decided that the new chosen people can only be homeless and disabled, deaf, blind, mute children from orphanages. But not only them, also the child peoples, as he calls them, child peoples must help with this new plan. The Samoyedic, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing correctly, Samoyedic or Nenets people, so the small people of the north. And it is precisely the Samoyeds and impaired children, according to Lenin's sclerotic vision, are a tabula rasa, innocent and not weighed down by sin, who can enter the Holy Land. Sharov's counterfactual novel mocks the utopian plans of Sovietization of the far north. Fictitious ideologists paternalistically transform the indigenous peoples into children with whom they can, without difference, create new history or their own history. So among Soviet national cultures and literatures, the native peoples has a very special position, or such as Evenks, Nanai, Khanty, Mansi, Chukchi, Koryak, Evenks, Eskimos, and so on. There were small people, so a very small number of them, and they had still very close tie to their traditions, to their ancestors. And it was combined with the fact of forced assimilation in the early Soviet Union, extermination, and the creation of a written culture from scratch in the 30s. Regarding the Soviet literature, these were the writers whose parents were often fishermen or shamans or hunters. The parents and grandparents spoke only their local languages, while they themselves, the writers, studies in boarding schools. Most of the cases, and later in higher education institutions in Russian capitals, Moscow and Leningrad. And indeed, it's worth mentioning that the most indigenous northern writers who were brought up and educated in so-called internate, so being conceived as backwards, so anstale. And they were not permitted to speak their local languages in these boarding schools, but only Russian. Practically all Soviet authors from the north I am discussing in my paper were educated in such schools and later in the universities and high schools, maybe in regional centers, as I said, or as I said, in capitals. And it was a very typical but also special situation that after they have got education there, they returned to their centers, to their small cultures, so to say, and had this kind of zeal, kind of passion of enlightenment to educate their peoples, to write dissertations from their own cultures, and to collect the folklore, the folk culture, so to carry field studies. So I think it's typical post-colonial situation of this biculturalism and this split, I would say, as I will show. So the works of this author ethnographers, as I call them, combined national myths with cultural translation and historiography. So it was a very complex process. There was a whole system of institutions, both regional and central, ready for the higher education of the representatives of the literary peripheries, almost immediately after Stalin's death. And we're speaking of the Thaw period, famously. So immediately after his death, organizations began to be created in the capitals, where the exchange between the center and the numerous non-centers were conducted, but primarily in one direction, from the center to the peripheries. For example, 1953, immediately, excuse me, yeah, Gorky Literary Institute I have mentioned already. And 1955, there was organized the Department of Literary Translations, appeared under the aegis of Lev Ozerov. I'm not sure if Lev Ozerov a famous person. Maybe you can comment.
Recently was translated in NYRB, so
just to mention for the yes, of course. And also, the Northern Institute of Leningrad State University, an important fact, became the department of the peoples of the far north of the Leningrad State Pedagogical Institute. So, for example, the Nenets Yuri Vella or the Khanty Yeremia Ipin graduated from the Gorky Literary Institute. Among the students were the Khantys Roman Rugin and Yuvan Shestalov, so locally very famous authors and writers, Chukchi Yuri Ritchel, or Alitet Nimtushkin, and the Nenets Vasily Vitkov. Vladimir Sangi, a Nivkh, so an ethnic Nivkh, graduated in the 60s from both the Advanced Literary course and the Gorky Literary Institute. While I studied this literature, it was rather meaningful, rather important for me to demonstrate that this Northern literature, Soviet literature, was mainly a product of the thaw, so of the period of the decanonization of the socialist realism. So the most numerous and most famous writers started publishing in the 50s, 60s, and then continuing in 60s and 70s. Although it is also important to mention that they had their prehistory in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Also very little studied. So the North came into Soviet literature as a young student that in the first generations of its authors had already had the opportunity of to be individualized and for deviations from the canon. Maybe in the spirit of Russian village prose, I would say that much of this literature, a great part of it, is a local variety, a local variant of the Russian village prose, but of course with its own peculiarities, and they are very interesting. So it was in no way a copy of what took place in the center, also in Russia. Though dressed and they were dressed in the clothing and speaking the language of the teacher, and even more importantly, the Northern indigenous literature started to reflect the identity crisis that was characteristic of the late socialist realism. The poetics of displacement, so it's one of the most interesting facts and research goals for me to investigate this writing, which shows many features of sort of performative displacement, as well as the fluctuations between two worlds, ethnic and socialist. And it was what I call a performative memory of the early Soviet deportations and the violence of the Soviet acculturation, and it was very violent. So whole ethnicity have been exterminated in the 30s. The peculiarity of the literatures of the Far North lays based on what I have said already, on the fact that the literary form and content from the center were the only initial template within which deviations or individual side perspective could appear, since they arose along with it, not prior to the Soviet culture. I would like to, I will try.
Yeah, it happened. It happened.
No, yes. So which are the main points I have discussed, already discussed, and I will be discussing today. It was a bit too late with this slide, but okay. I will cite now this fragment. It's quote from a scholar of Northern on Bruce Grant. In contrast to their larger Republican counterparts, such as the Uzbeks or Georgians, the native peoples of the North were considered to be essentially without culture. Not a palimpsest, but a tabula rasa, onto which a new Soviet identity and way of life could be inscribed. Hence, the departure from the strict socialist realism during the thaw and later in the 60s and 70s and 80s could not be even a partial return to their own local traditions. No, maybe to own literary tradition, to local tradition, yes, because they have their language, have their languages and so on, but not the literary tradition of national writing, where the re-ethnicization back to the roots of village prose, for example, in Russia could not be thought of as an appeal to the cultural past. Literature often became an amalgam of ethnography and folklore and could invent curious, really very curious form of synthesis of these different worlds. If the other national literatures reinvented themselves under the conditions of Soviet patronage, Northern writers had to invent themselves for the first time. This was also tied to the linguistic status quo around the 50s, 60s. The single Northern alphabet created in the 1930s and translated 1937 or 38 to Cyrillic, did not account for the whole diversity of the Northern dialects. And this diversity was, of course, perceptible for the, bearers, for the representatives of the Northern literatures, but not for Russians. And the first literary texts in several of these dialects had to be invented by the authors and then translated into the Russian lingua franca in order to enter the distribution system of multinational Soviet literatures and in order to simply be read. For example, when Yeremy Aypin, I mentioned him, and I will mention him once again, when he arrived in Moscow in the early 1970s to study at the Literary Institute, he immediately ran into a language problem. No literature in his native Agan dialect, so Agansky dialect, yet existed, so that the professors could read through his first drafts at the university. He had to translate them into Russian. And despite the fact that this linguistic asymmetry existed also, of course, also in other national literatures, it was particularly distinct or peculiar in the new created literatures, since the just born child had often already been handed over to the foster parents, so to say. It's a metaphor of mine, and the unification of the original diversity, undoubtedly, of the original diversity and codification in the framework of the new family of literatures, all became the conditions of birth and growth of this, so to say, child. So these local varieties of socialist realism in the regions I'm discussing manifested many characteristics of the so-called hyphenated literatures that have been actively studied and discussed in the recent decades as minoritarian and post-colonial texts in America, in Spain and France, and so on. For example, stylistic and genre hybridity, biculturalism, and sometimes the techniques of covert resistance to the master plot or master language of the colonizer, and different forms of compromises. And of course, we know Ethiopian language, and we know different forms of indirect speech, but here it was a very ethnically marked and, for example, ecologically marked and so on. I hope I will show it a bit. So this literature was, I would say, the performative evidence of cultural coexistence with the Russian Soviet mainstream. And they were examples of the appropriation of what studies of empires and colonialism and Sovietology was a part of this post-colonial studies, maybe starting in early 90s, I would say, what they call modernity. The next one. Yes. One of the key concepts of post-colonial theory is the idea of multiple or alternative modernities. It's a famous concept. So Opry Envisor writes about adapting or translating modernity into specific local variants in China or South Korea, and that are very good examples for me because these are Asian. You can speak about a global Asian culture as coexisted with European. So a sort of quotation of Europe in Asia, challenging the monopoly and universalism of the European model of progress, education, and the state of civilization. Envisor introduces the concept of petit modernity, which is in constant dialogue and conflict, so sort of negotiation with concept of grand modernity. So grand modernity, yeah. What would you say? Yeah. So the post-colonial writing is primarily manifested as asserted by a couple of other important scholars, Bill Ashcroft, Garrett Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin, as in the very act of creating a text in the language of the imported, appropriated culture. That is, this writing is a sort an act of partial identification with this. But I would also like to mention another important fact is that the social realism in Soviet literature was not the only template for the writers. It began much earlier in the 19th century, and that was Russian writers, ethnographers, and scientists who traveled to Siberia and wrote their travel narratives about them, and in early 20th century as well. And these writers read this travel books. Hence, they, on the one hand, reproduced the available writing about themselves and Russian socialist realist Russian in whole, but on the other hand, they invented themselves or a view of themselves as simultaneously native, but or an alien or the other. Many of them created literature in at least 2 languages, it's important to say, and a careful analysis of self-translations, for example, or different versions of the same novel in different languages would be would provide a very important insight into what this literature was actually. I'm working only with Russian texts, and my interest consists of is concentrated on the contamination of Russian language writing with indigenous elements and perspectives, what engenders a kind of linguistic displacement and ideological ambiguity. Thank you. My first example is Ivan Shestalo. The writer and poet Ivan Shestalov is called the peer or master of Mansi literature. And he was the son of one of the first northern communists. And his father was an organizer and chairman of the local kolkhoz. So an activist, early Soviet activist. And he was the grandson of shaman, a sort of contradiction for himself. That was significant to his world view, or the image of the world. So Shestalov had the biography of a completely successful exponent or representative of Soviet multinational literature was recognized, and his collection entitled Языческая поэма, so pagan epic, was particularly famous. So Brezhnev, for example, liked it very much. And it was awarded the RSFSR State Prize. So the main character of Shestalov's story, I just pick out as one of many interesting examples from his prose. This Secret of Nenets, the secret, Тайны Nenets, the secret of Nenets. The main character is a man named Sergei, is a deputy of the regional Soviet. I quote, Sergei's father was a man of the forest. He observed the laws and beliefs of the taiga, like granddad and great-dad and great-granddad. This nostalgic tonality nonetheless does not allow the reader to identify with the past. And that is, for example, rather interesting because this past is somewhat nostalgic in the prose, but it is always identified with the child view, so to say, a young people. It is, for example, it is placed in the character's childhood memories, and they also nonetheless localize them in the space of fables, fairy tales, so to say, which do not conform to the complexity of the gone forward. So this infantilization of the narratives or hero's voice is, I think, was truly post-colonial and peculiar. It revealed a split between internalization of the foreign paternalistic gaze and the subtle revolt against this gaze. It was typical of the spirit of the late Soviet era, the era of restrained quest of alternatives, so as village prose as way, but there were a lot of varieties, national varieties of the Soviet prose, I said it already, and of spiritual alternatives in the late Soviet time, for example, palliated atheism, so it was not the strict atheism of the 40s or even 50s, but it was somewhat diverse. However, the Ivan Shestalov's narratives also conveys what I call a poetics of sutures, poetic shlov, typical in a situation where one culture is grafted onto another one that was until recently still unwritten. When the bear, medved, suffers a diarrhea in this story due to the contamination of the forest, then the wolverine, Rosamacha, reads him a lecture about how pollution of the atmosphere has taken on a global character, and it sharply reduces the productivity of the agricultural culture's lands, she says. This Rosamacha, who obviously embodies the author, or alter ego of the author, becomes an activist and educator of the bear. And bear is somewhat backward, I would say, on the issues of global ecology. Furthermore, she is politically grounded and voices the perplexity that, I quote Rosamacha, the concentration of harmful substances, pollution in the air of London, Tokyo, or Brussels is dozens of times higher than the maximum permissible norms. Don't understand how they can live there. Don't understand what they can breathe. Could that be why they're ground and skinny? That is why they're so skinny, those well-trained Europeans. It reminds me of Lukashenko's performances in this time. However, when she challenges the bear to read the forest newspaper, political newspaper, and move along with the times, he replies, "Почеши мне лучше спину. You would rather you scratch my back." So it is, I think it's a bit humorous, but also in very Soviet spirit. And but just as in the other national Soviet literatures, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Northern social criticism was a time of reflection or re-evaluation of history as well, of restoring it to the local memory and of permitted corrections. So the Sovietization of indigenous Siberia was accordingly not only inscribed into the very texture of this literature, but also was an object of representations and analysis. And that is exactly a very important step to research on this, because they got their agency, their sort of local or ethnic empowerment through this representation and analysis. For example, Soviet modernization, the creation of the alphabet, the elimination of illiteracy, ликвидация неграмотности, these are names of famous campaigns in the early Soviet Union, введение гигиены, I'm not sure, introduction of hygiene and technology in these regions, and instruction in schools, and so on. They are depicted in this prose and are constantly portrayed as a sort of cultural clash or cultural combination. It's very ambiguous, I think. So it's sort of clash or meeting between the oral culture and the written culture, between the education and the religion, and between the native and some backward maybe, and the alien, so the educated culture. Ivan Shestolov's stories, The Secret of Nanai, contains, for example, a documentary, an autobiographical narrative about Sergei during his studies in Leningrad. I will quote it in Russian, but you have the translation here. 925 год. Их было немного, всего 19 парней. Ханты и манси, ненцы и нанайцы, саами, юкагиры, эвенки и чукчи. Что им предстояло? Им предстояло в считанные годы сделать шаг через тысячелетия. Неграмотные еще вчера дети тайги и тундры, оказавшись в городе Ленин, вскоре будто переродились. Нет, они не забыли про огонь и живые деревья. Но книга пробудила в них нового охотника. I think it's rather interesting. The book, what do you say, awaked in them a new hunter. Страница как снег, буквы как следы. Чьи это следы? Нет, не зверя. Мысли ходили по этой странице. So it's very interesting. I think it's a poetic of merging cultural contrasts and transformation, where the page of a book is a sort of snowy field of the homeland, and it is meant to harmonize the hunt and the education, hence also the dialogue between the center and periphery. It's a sort of insertion of modernity into this pantheistic picture of the world. Okay, I just a couple of minutes. Okay. So the step across the millennia, the шаг через тысячелетия, was in the Northern stories the subject not of historical novel, but of an autobiographical tale. So history compressed into decades, or even a couple of years, equated the growth of the character, narrator, and author. It was not a historical novel, for example, but autobiographical, because the history coincided with biography. Vasily Vitkov, it's another example. Vasily Vitkov, who was a Rundi herder's son, So I missed a slide, but I will tell about him. So Vasily Vitkov was also a son of a hunter and really herder. Мальчишкой помогал пастухам пасти оленей, ходил с отцом на охоту, сам ставил капканы на песца и зайцев и не водил со взрослыми рыбу. В долгие зимние вечера любил слушать сказки и песни стариков. But by the time he was in the 8th grade of the boarding school, he was anxiously translated stories about Michurin into the Nenets language, and in the 10th Lev Tolstoy's children's stories. So, с трепетом переводил на ненецкий язык рассказы о Мичурине, в 10-м детские рассказы Льва Толстого. Okay, Aletet Nimtushkin, it's also very interesting and typical biography. Born to a family of hunters, Nimtushkin was educated on the one hand in the old traditions by his grandmother, Ogdo, and on the other in boarding schools beyond and in contradiction to these traditions. Interestingly, his aunt Senkoik was a very influential shaman. Some of his relatives were repressed in the 30s and killed, so executed. Others died from illness in the process of hygiene measures. It's also a very famous fact of indigenous peoples that they got a lot of diseases and illness in the process of modernization and civilization. So they died from illness, and yet others, including his father, died during the Second World War. He himself graduated from the Leningrad Herzen Pedagogical Institute in '61 and returned to Evenks to work as a journalist and later as a poet and prose writer. His story «Мне снятся небесные олени», I dream of heavenly rindi, is another example of the poetics of an ideological gap, a partial non-acceptance, but also possibly of intentional silencing of forbidden topics. So, for example, in the native tent, Chumi, it was warm, the fire burns merrily, and the kind grandmother Eki potters around it. We are presented a domestic space populated by spirits, rituals, local words, and things that are translated into Russian all the time. But at the same time, the child, the main character of this story, of this novel, Amarcha, have hung the portrait of the chairman of the Presidium of the USSR, Mikhail Kalinin, in his honor. So we have in the same house a portrait of Mikhail Kalinin and these fish idols, and that is why I titled my paper this way. Because the grandmother thinks that Mikhail Kalinin is a god, so to say, another idol. And maybe once more. I think it's a very typical post-colonial example. Just look at these two pictures. It's the same person, Yeremy IP, as a representative of his local culture and as a deputy of the Russian government and activist. So when the time of perestroika arrived, it's my last point, not only could Soviet history be analyzed as a process of linguistic and cultural translation, but it could also become the subject of partial revision, invective, and even the explicit idea of colonization of the indigenous North. So it is also important to mention that the notion of colonization, colonial condition, came from the writers themselves. It's not a sort of position from the scholars. So Jeremy Ampin, in his most famous novel, Khanty или звезда утренней зари, the history of communist in the native characters take deculakization, the arrest and executions of the 30s to be the revenge of the unclean spirit. Here they call the new regime the Red Tsar, or the Blood Eye, кровавый глаз, or Красный Царь. And I quote, here you have, он был многолик, прозывали его по-разному, Самирин, тот нечистый дух, so the Soviet power, импесиот, ибо он вездесущ, мог в самом неожиданном облике всплыть и тут, и там. Мог нагрянуть днем и ночью, поздно вечером и рано утром, он мог все. Он незримо присутствовал всюду, он все видел и слышал, он знал, о чем думал каждый человек. И в каждый приезд он увозил с собой врагов народа, от 3-4 до десятка человек. Moreover, the characters in Aipin's novel compare the practices of Soviet and American colonization and liken the fate of the Khanty to that of American Indians. The fictitious American researcher Catherine Jefferson arrives in this novel in the village to observe the life of Khanty culture, which is dying out. She explains to a native that in ancient times, before the strait was formed, the Aztecs and the Gauls, and the names of ancient peoples of Mennye, probably lived alongside American Indians. In an issue of National Geographic that Catherine brought with her, Nim Yan sees photographs of Indian settlements and senses an ancient kinship between his tribe and the Indian tribes. This kinship is an echo of the socialist zeal for the friendship of peoples. Of course, it resembles this socialist ideology of friendship of peoples, but not only. It is a sort of new perspective on the destinies of global community, emerging global community of oppressed people in the perestroika time. Catherine does not succeed in collecting materials because the culture of the Siberian natives and they themselves have almost died out. But the regional administration demonstrates the official folklore, a sort of Potemkinskие деревни, Potemkin villages. Yes, it's my one of the first slides. I just quote: в истреблении людей приоритет принадлежит вашим колонизаторам. Возможно, но колонизаторы всех стран и времен совершенно одинаковы. Да? Колонизаторы английские, французские, испанские, русские и прочие. Будь они в Америке, в Африке или в Сибири, все они одинаковые. Колонизаторы русские, а их не было. Они не снимали скальпы, даже в царские времена. Вам повезло, в отличие от индейцев. So I come to my last point. It's sort of the end of this period. I'm investigating. By the end of the ages, text would appear that openly portrayed the ecological catastrophe of Siberia, the forced resettlements of minorities, and the extermination of entire ethnicities. This genre of counter-narratives, so this genre of counter-narratives, this type of writing is a very post-colonial phenomenon, a sort of counter-version of Soviet historiography would emerge. Writers would turn into politicians. Jeremy Aipin, for example, I showed it already, would become a member of the Council of People's Deputies and a representative of the Russian Federation's presidential office in the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug. and would become an activist for the preservation of the disappearing cultures and nature of the peoples of Yugra. He would speak in 1994 at the 49th session of the UN from the Arctic. In 2002, he would publish the novel Божья Матерь в кровавых снегах, so the Mother of God in the Bloody Snows, in which, by bringing a lot of numerous documents, so this literature was very much documentary, because they collected forbidden documents from the Soviet era. They worked in archives. So he will tell the story of the 1933-34 Kazim rebellion, Kazimskое восстание, brutally suppressed by the Red Army, which led to the almost complete annihilation of the native Aztec populations and their culture. The Nenets writer Anna Nerkagi didn't discuss here, but in another paper in Новое литературное обозрение, he would become a Christian missionary, an ecological preacher, an educator of the adopted orphan children. You would ask maybe why Christian, but maybe you know the answer already, because they were polytheistic, these peoples of the north. They were missioned and converted to Christian religion in 19th century, but they were allowed to preserve their own religion. So this local customs and religious custom and so on. So I didn't mention it because it's too much for today, but Anna Nerkagi made a very, very typical move towards the Christianity in the post-Soviet world, because it was a time of rebirth of Christianity and Orthodox Church. And in 1996, she would write the apocalyptic Phantasmagoria Молчащей, so silent, in which she would accuse the intelligentsia of betrayal and spiritual villainy. And that reminds me on Russian village girls, this nationalist narrative and this resentment against Russian intelligentsia, Soviet power, and so on. And Vasily Litkov would participate in 1985 in a conference of indigenous writers from all over the world under the aegis of UNESCO, and in the 92 conference of Uralic or Uralski language writers in Finland. He would go to Scandinavia to talk about the Nenets and their literature. So I think his ecological interest was shift from the Soviet to the global north. And it's interesting because a global south and global north, it was a typical narrative problem question in the post-Soviet time and until today. And finally, Ivan Shestalov, for the first time after the ban, organized the Tuliglab bear festivities in the village Sasva in the Berezova region, which were broadcast on central televisions. Along with the writers, Yeremia Pin, Tatiana Moldanova, and other like-minded people, he established the Toruma, or Toruma, God's Land, open-air museum, which exists today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And please excuse my English. I will try to manage the question.
You're fine. We have one question online, but I will open the discussion with my question, going back to what you mentioned about Nerkagi. So could you please say a few words about her? Because first of all, she is the only female writer that you mentioned, and I wonder if there are other female authors in this cohort. Second, as far as I know, she began with texts that now can be read as quite post-colonial, right? Any poems wrote on the autobiographical text, and then her second novel, A Year, right, which is a truly tragic text. But what happened after that, I didn't know. And what you said about her return to Christianity, I disagree with your interpretation because I think that as we know, Christianization was one of the forms of colonization in the Russian Empire, at least.
Yes.
And the transformation of the representative indigenous people into the Christian preacher is paradoxical, at least. So how maybe some other comments.
Okay, thank you. Very important question, Mark. Nerkagi is a writer, very peculiar representative of this literatures, who wrote very typical prose in this like Soviet time. You mentioned two famous texts of her. I think it's important to realize this period of transition from the late Soviet ideology, so to say, this mild socialist realism, to the time of perestroika and first post-Soviet times as a sort of how to say of radical re-evaluation of the Soviet power. And what happened with Nerkagi is that he idealized this Christian power of the 19th century because it was a rather mild power compared with the Soviet power, because these northern peoples were allowed to freely live with their religious, and to combine them with Christian religion. So it was a sort of, maybe not polytheistic, but polytheistic, of course, but a biculturalism. And I think it's important, of course, it was post-colonial, but it was also idealized as some wonderful past of this peoples and tribes. And what you asked about the Christianity, it was another process. I think she was a part of this all Russian rebirth of Orthodox Church. And it's important to say that these people turned just to another ideology. And it is a typical path and typical way to resentment, to nationalism, but also to very valuable processes of re-evaluation of their own culture. So it's rather complex, I think, and I write about it better than I speak.
Thank you, well, and thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I'm sorry not want to thank you properly. We have the question from Mary Nicholas. Let me read it. I'm so struck by the irony of using one colonial language to discuss the decolonization of works done in another colonial language about a third language. So I'm wondering about the strength of decolonial discourse in the languages of formerly colonized cultures. Is there a vigorous debate or at least a dialogue with speakers of the indigenous languages of the North?
Very, very important. I think it's very, thank you, Mary. It's very important to deconstruct ourselves as scholars and our position as scholars. I'm speaking English now. I'm investigating the text in Russian. And of course, I learned a bit of these northern languages, but not very well, I must confess. So I'm trying to combine this or to trace or to correspond to this multicultural subject of research, but I must say that it is just very difficult, and there is particularly no research about it. We have two traditions: the Western tradition of researching these minor literatures, and these works are written mainly in English. And the second part of this research is written in Russian or in local languages, and they're almost unfamous. So the scholars the philologists and cultural historians are almost unfamous, and their works as well. And I think it is a sort of post-colonial situation in research. For example, we know Yuri Slezkin, and his monograph, his book, Arctic Melos, Arctic. But I think, and I mentioned in my article, that he reproduces somewhat the point of view of colonizers, because the writes about that all northern peoples created came from the center, and I contradict this point of view. And that is my task, to show that it was much more complex and much more hybrid poetics. And the second laggard is the second camp, so to say, of the researchers, who I said almost unfamous. They have almost no names in the academia, in the international academia. They have another tendency, tendency to self-victimization. For example, they are very attentive to the poetics of this literature, because they possess these languages. They know that they have the language skills, but I think that they have no theoretical apparatus with which they could work. And maybe I'm not right, but the works I read were sort of very descriptive, nostalgical, and with a zeal of self-empowerment, so to say. I think it's rather ideological research. So I think the situation is rather bad and rather, how to say, scarce. And so it's our future task to go further. And it's different in ethnology and ethnography. There are more works in the field of ethnography about and very famous, but also English-speaking Western scholars, and almost nothing about literatures and cultures. So that was the gap I want to fill in.
Thank you so much. Pavel Limbersky, the famous writer, tells us, "Thank you for your talk, Klavdia. It was very illuminating." And Mary Nichols, thanks so much. Very intense and really fascinating research, food for thought. So let's turn the discussion to our ample audience, and thank you very much for coming. And let's use the chance of being here in this room and sort of having a live conversation about Klavdia's talk.
If you would like. It's not
Thank you so much for this talk.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Heather Atkins. I'm a postdoc here at the Harriman Institute. I'm kind of curious the extent to which one can generalize across all of these different national contexts in the North. And one part of that, I work in Altai Republic, which is to the south. But I mean, a lot of these, I'm curious the impact that the place of these various peoples within the administrative structure of the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation had on the sort of political economy of how literature was produced and circulated. So if you were in my own context in Altai Republic, there was a fairly robust native literary culture throughout the Soviet period, because they were at least de jure and autonomous oblasts. They had at least, they got a few pennies from the center to operate papers and presses.
Yes.
But this was probably a very different situation if you were not the titular ethnicity of an autonomous oblast or some sort of autonomous region that at least had some sort of formal administrative structure for sponsoring artists and stuff like that. So in which case your only way of getting published would be to write in Russian or to get your work translated. So I'm curious if there are these major kind of similarities of sort of like a community of fate in the North. I'm curious the limitations to generalization because of the, in many ways, drastically different historical contexts that these various groups are operating in, and the just the sort of simple political realities of if you're a Sahara writer writing in a fairly wealthy federal subject with a huge potential audience of native speakers, or if you're a Yukagir writer without sort of any sort of political administrative structure that you can sort of appeal to. Yeah, just your thoughts on what are the limitations to generalization.
Thank you so much. It's a very large question, and I'm not a historian of this northern people. There are just several, not cultural histories, but histories of this. I think, if I understood you properly, it was a history of different degrees of central governments or several governing of these cultures. For example, in the 30s we have colonization. I'm not sure how you translate it. So colonization. Okay. So sort of allowance, a sort of manifestation of regional cultures of these small peoples, but it changed later. For example, in 40s, 50s, and 60s, alongside with the processes that I described here, it was the situation of in which the most officials were Russian, but also representatives of the local authorities. They coexisted and co-worked, but the general political line was of Russification, of course, because they had almost no schools or literature or, I don't know, writing traditions in their languages. And so there has been an attempt to create this alphabet, but it was rather, well, a rather unhappy attempt to correspond to this variety. But I'm sorry, maybe I cannot answer your question.
I think what Tyler means, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the support to local cultures would be different if there is an administrative structure of the autonomous region, like Sakha, right, or Nevenets autonomous, right, and smaller peoples who didn't have this administrative sort of unit to support them. Is there a difference in development of literature and culture based on this distinction?
But how can you say that? Because there was
that's the question.
There were no peoples that they
were. But there were large regions, right? For instance, there was Khanty Nationalny Okrug, Komi-Permyatsky, Evenki, right, Chukot, correct? And supposedly they had some kind of administrative financing, budgeting, and they had the titular nation, titular people, right? But certainly these didn't cover the entire variety of peoples there, right? Yes. And so exactly. So what's the difference in the development? Can you see the difference in the development of the literatures of those who were administratively backed and those who sort of fall between the cracks of this administrative system?
Excuse me. So that's a very interesting question, but I can't answer it unfortunately, because I didn't compare them. I think that the dialects or local languages, I don't want to call them dialects, local languages, not all of them survived the process of Sovietization. So the literature we know is also in local languages, and which is a bit started in the recent years. It's the result of Sovietization, and of this we have only a couple of northern languages and writing, and the Russian language.
That were preserved.
Yes.
And cultivated.
Yes, but it's a very long history, which I'm describing in another article. And of course, you have to study the linguistic, the history of language politics in Asian North in the Soviet Union. There are a couple of wonderful scholars about on this topic. Yes, I could recommend a couple of books. Thank you for this. Yes, it's important. Yes.
Thank you
Introduce
so
yourself,
much,
please.
yeah, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My name is Valeria Mutz. I'm a postdoc at the Harriman Center here at Columbia. And yeah, I have so many questions, but I'll limit myself to sort of following up on this question and on your answer. Could you speak a little bit more about the economic conditions of these writers and how they were paid? Were they sort of, where did they know who the reader was and whether that affected their choice of, of the genre? For example, you mentioned, as far as I understand, they wrote novels, they also wrote or translated, transcribed their fairy tales. So how did they choose the genre? Did they think about the, the reader, whether it's going to be an indigenous reader or a reader from Moscow or Petersburg or something like that? Because I was listening to you talk about this, and I'm thinking I specialize in pre-revolutionary literature, and there is a lot of literature about the Russian North and the Russian Arctic, but the genre is almost exclusively either an adventure tale or a proto-science fiction.
Travel.
So something like научная фантастика,
Yes.
or proto again. Naучная фантастика, both written by the people from the center who have never been to any of these regions, and people and writers who are from the northern territories. They also write in this genre. So I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about this, the economic conditions and the genre.
Okay, thank you. Just a small question. In early Soviet times, there were научная фантастика or something?
In pre-revolutionary.
In pre-revolution.
Yeah,
okay.
it's not
I
quite
see.
correct to call it научная фантастика. It's
Because it's
something
it's a bit
approaching
ridiculous.
научная фантастика.
Well, I think I can partially answer your question. Maybe the part concerning the cultural condition and the readership. It's a part of my research actually to read these novels, fairy tales, stories as a special writing. So what genres? It's my German. Well, regarding the variety of genres and types of writing, there are a great variety of them, but the most interesting is this mixed genre of story, novel, ethnographic narratives, scientific narratives, for example, with statistics, but also with local myths. And that is really interesting because it resembles the status or the position of the author as the only one of very few representatives, scholars, and representatives of the literature writers of this very culture. So that is why I think that it's sort of poetica schroff, so poetics of split. Scenes, yes, because you find everything within one novel, for example, and different styles as well, socialist, realist, but also fairy tale, and somewhat some pieces of the Russian literature from the 19th century, but also a very metafictional device, because they step out of the narration and begin to describe their local culture, to present some the history of their folk and so on. That is what I was interested in. But I would add to this that it would be very important to study their self-translations. There were not always the self-translations, but a major group of these writers in the first and second generation of the Northern literature created two versions of of their novels, for example. And it would be, I mentioned it would be very interesting to read both, because I think, and what I can trace, that the writings translated into their local languages were different compared with the Russian version. They allowed themselves much more. For example, in this position between socialist Russian and the own and the alien, so to say. So, and economic condition is a very interesting question, but maybe.
To continue on Valeria's question, where most of them lived? Where did they live? Did they live with their peoples or with their tribes? I know that Nirkaki at certain point, after living, I think in Chelyabinsk, she returned to her tribe and started living back in the very, very dire conditions. That was their own, and that's exactly where she turned into this proselyte of Christianity. What about others?
Different, but it is very interesting, because the most of them, or many of them, moved to capitals.
Yeah.
The early period to study at these institutes and universities in Leningrad and Moscow, and then many of them stayed there just to write their socialist realist prose in Russian. But later in 60s, 70s, and 80s, some of them returned to their okrugi and so on, just to возрождать, to resurrect their local cultures. And Nirkagi is a good example, because she was one of the activists of her culture. And the most writer I am writing about, I think that the greater part returned as well to there, and it was a sort of double life, because they had an apartment, because particularly those who was recognized as Soviet writers and had their money, their salaries, they were paid for their writing, is maybe to your question. So they
very well.
Good. Yes,
Extremely well.
Ivan Shestalo, for example, was a very recognized, acknowledged author, but not all of them, of course. They could live in Leningrad, for example, and the other time maybe in some of their regions. So I think it's very interesting to trace this movement of Northern literatures from the periphery to the center, alongside the biography of the authors who moved as well and wanted to be read there. But it changed in the very late Soviet time.
It's wonderful that you are talking about these authors, because in the Anglophone world, the only representative of this culture is Yuri Rudkov, who is actually a misrepresentative, because he exactly is the one who left Chukotka in the very early age, and then he became very much sort of pampered Soviet writer with huge honoraria, with a very wealthy life, and he was basically orientalizing the world he was representing until Roman Abramovich became the governor of Chukotka, and he, again for very high honorarium, I guess, brought him there as some kind of the supreme shaman, where he stayed for a while. Any other questions?
Just maybe a small comment. Yes, you're right. It's I've forgotten. Okay, later. I just wanted to mention Vladimir Samgi. That is why it was a sort of contrast to Yuri Rudkov, because Samgi was a dissident, so to say, and he was an underground or semi-underground poet, and he was not paid for his, of course, so he had to earn his living with different jobs, and I think that his poetry is a true representation of this bicultural, positive biculturalism. I think, and Vladimir Sangi has experienced such a sort of much interest in recent years, I think. Recent years. So very.
Because he was beginning also in this theoretical way. He had his semi-ethnographic novel that was published in Roman Gazeta, and Roman Gazeta was an amazing publication because, first of all, its copy run frequently reached 500,000 or 600,000 copies. And on the other hand, in the Soviet Union, there was a system of publications when the book publication, the first publication would be rated higher than the republications. And although it was just a journal with one novel inside, it counted as a journal publication and not as a book publication. Although it was very cheap, very available everywhere, in every bookstand, in every newsstand, and I read his novel in this edition. So, but then, as you're saying, he transformed.
It's a very typical biography as well, not only of the Soviet writers, painters, but of a lot of people that they, or a lot of underground artists and writers that they began in their regions, or maybe also in the capitals, if they were Russians, officially, public officially, and to go along Soviet ideology. My father, for example, as well, but then they turned. I think that it's also a very important subject because the multinational Soviet literature was an institution that not only educated in Russian, but also offered a possibility to deviate from the canon, and they did it in the late Soviet time, maybe to go underground or to become a semi-official author. There were a lot of gray zones, great areas between official and unofficial. But it was typical to begin in the 50s, for example, within the main line of the party, and the multinational Soviet literature is still unstudied as a sort of colonial institution, which was very complex. We will publish a volume, I hope next year, me and Evgeny Doblenko, on this subject. I hope so, just to trace different ways and complexities within this institution of multinational Soviet literature. I hope we'll manage.
Tanya, do you want?
Oh, yes.
Tanya,
I'm sorry.
Let's give the floor to Tanya. You got a chance, so let's Tanya.
Sorry.
Smile to the
I had a very good question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if these writers were in contact with one another, and if we can imagine a community, a network, or rather than them kind of like pursuing their individual agendas. And yes, when you talk about especially the ideas of like the global north, whether they were actually conceptualizing themselves as a community.
Yes, in Soviet times, there existed a community in Soviet times, but not really a community. I think it was a sort of network, maybe. Or they didn't meet, as I know, didn't meet a lot of times, but they knew about each other, of course, I would say that it became a community after the fall of the Soviet Union, as they began to fight together for the resurrection of their cultures. They attended the same conferences, and they went global, so to say. I think it's also started a very interesting process from the Soviet North to the global North in Scandinavia, Arctic countries, and so on. A sort of westernization of Soviet Northern literatures, but also not just the West, the movement towards the West, but also global North, the issues of ecology, of survival, of the consequences of modernization, for example, devastations in these regions, or the consequences of the introduction of alcohol into these cultures, what it was, was
Exactly as you said.
which was very how to say devastating. Yes. I'm very sorry.
Unfortunately, Clara has to catch a plane in 2.5 hours, right? So
Yeah,
you
I'm
should
very
let her go, but she's around. And if you want to continue talking with her, use this chance and so on. Thank you very much, Clara.
thank you,
for your
Mark.
talk. Thank
Thank you so much. And thank you for the questions. Maybe I can, if you are interested, I can share with you some publications because it's much more interesting to read me than to listen to me, I think.
It was very.
It was very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're in time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Round. Very good.